one about the EPA stories. There was a report on it that they are woefully behind on writing up all the new regulations that the Biden administration are calling for to deal with climate change. And remember, there is a clock on this that actually is not just tied to the Biden administration. You all remember that that CRA legislation, that law, the Congressional Review Act, which allows an incoming Congress to essentially overturn administrative orders that take place from a prior administration, and not only overturn them, but make them impossible to reestablish without 2/3 approval from Congress. Now, this is obviously, this is I guess both parties want it, but it's particularly helpful to the Republicans because more often than not, you have regulations that are proffered by a Democratic presidency that Republicans perceive as infringing on corporate freedom to pollute and harm citizens and to hurt workers, et cetera, et cetera. There were 1,200 scientists and policy experts during the Trump administration that left the agency. We've talked about this. We talked about this when Trump actually got into office. I think we spoke to Sam Bagenstos, who was with the Department of Justice during the Clinton years and then back again during the Obama years, and saw what the 8 years of the Bush administration did to the Department of Justice infrastructure. And this is a perfect example of how agencies get destroyed during a Republican administration. That is, particularly the Trump administration with Scott, I can't remember the Pruitt, who came from, I think it was Kansas, who's Oklahoma, whose primary function was to sue the EPA and keep them from imposing their regulations on his state. And so the loss of 1,200 people means that the EPA under Biden has actually prosecuted less environmental criminals, if you will, than under the Trump administration. Because these agencies, to a large extent, function on inertia and on their own sort of like, they're their own sort of fiefdoms. And it's much easier to destroy than it is to build up. And it's much easier to drive people out of 1,200 people out of a job than it is to attract 1,200 people who've been there for years and have institutional memory, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, and this is something that's really important for people to understand. When you're voting for a president, you're not just voting for that person. You're not even voting for the people that they will necessarily appoint around them. You're voting for a broad and, without a doubt, insufficient in many instances, in most instances, but a broad mandate to maintain the functions of government. And this is inhibiting the good things that Biden wants to do in terms of the EPA. It's inhibiting the ability of the EPA to police, to provide enforcement, to write new chemical regulations, to do more research, et cetera, et cetera. And one statistic that I just found amazing. Staffing at the EPA peaked in 2004, during the Bush administration. there were 17,611 employees. It was Whitman, right? From New Jersey, who I believe was the EPA chief in that first administration. And it just so happened that the EPA was just not a place that the Bush administration was looking to attack. They had a lot of other things going on at that time. They had to wage multiple wars and completely sell the American public on that. So their focus was not on that. 17,611 employees. There are 3,500 less employees now.
Wait, what's that figure?
17,611 in 2004 and 15,400 when Trump entered. And now there's 14,172. And so just, think about the implications of losing that institutional knowledge. If you're running a business, 20% turnover is huge. But actually, it's attrition. I mean, there's not even been turnover. Those seats have not been filled again. And more than likely, you lost people who were just starting their careers there and decided, this is not going to be my career. Or people who were on the tail end of their careers who had all the institutional knowledge to train people, to figure out the easiest ways of implementing things. So this is what happens during a Republican administration. I mean, they were particularly hostile to the EPA.
And we saw it happen to the IRS too, right? Like we're living in the wake of that, and this is what's happening to the EPA in real time.
Over 10 years, real problems at the IRS. That has been also, I think, legislatively mandated in that they cut funding dramatically. But also things like Bureau of Land Management, they were dispersed, I think, out into the outside of Washington, and they forced a lot of people to move. So I imagine you had big numbers there. We should try and find maybe somebody who can speak to that. Maybe the Revolving Door Project. They may have a better sense of that. But it's very rare that you see that level of being kept track of just like what's happening to these agencies. The idea that we would have 20 years later, 20% less EPA staffing is absurd.
Given climate change.
Exactly.
The reason that was lower on the list of priorities for the Bush administration among in addition to what you describe, is that people didn't have the broader awareness that they do now about climate change and what we need to do. And enforcement is
probably true.
Necessary.
That's probably true. And of course, largely speaking, I think it just flew under the radar. There wasn't, you didn't have the 10 years of the Obama administration, which was, inhibiting the growth of the oil and gas industry. Like you say, it was not becoming sort of like a government policy or understanding until that time.